Our first speaker in opposition tonight is Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Sir Malcolm is a former Conservative MP who has served in the cabinets of Thatcher and Major, most notably as Foreign Secretary and Secretary of State for Defence. Between 2010 and 2015, Sir Malcolm also served as the Chair of Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. Sir Malcolm, you have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you for your introductory remarks. You didn't mention the most important job I did, which was Secretary of State for Scotland for 5 years. I'm delighted to be in Cambridge. I can assure you I don't intend to make a very long speech. I shall follow the very wise precedent of King Henry VIII, who apparently said to each of his 6 wives, "Please don't worry, I don't intend to keep you long." I compliment the proposer of this motion on his remarks. We obviously have to beg to differ. I'm an Edinburgh man. I don't have the privilege of being a Cambridge graduate, but I am a graduate of a university that began in 1582. And it is perhaps more than insignificant that a small, relatively poor country like Scotland had 4 universities for 500 years, while England made do with 2 until the middle of the 19th century. So such has been the Scottish commitment to education, and all the more credit for that. Now, there are, of course, Edinburgh is a capital city. The proposer didn't make this point. You can be a capital city of a country even if you're part of a greater union. And there are great differences. You in Cambridge, if you decide to visit London, many of you would say how you were going up to London. In Edinburgh, we don't talk about going up to London, we talk about going down to London, because we're going to a different country. And the Scots have many characteristics, some good, some not so good. As one said, the Scots are very well balanced, we've got chips on both shoulders. So there are these national characteristics, and they're all very much to our credit, both in Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And the single most fundamental flaw in what the proposer said in his motion, and it was picked up by a questioner from the back, he implied that Scotland cannot realize its national identity unless it breaks away from the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom, as we all hear, is regularly referred to as the 4 nations. We are 4 nations, each of which had a different national history, but which came together centuries ago, not years ago, centuries ago, and have prospered remarkably ever since. And I'll come back to this in my subsequent remarks. So at the moment, we're going through extraordinary turmoil in Scotland because of the pending resignation of Nicola Sturgeon. This has very interesting constitutional significance, well worth mentioning. If you are seeking to lead what is in effect a revolutionary movement, seeking to the most dramatic change that Scotland has known for hundreds of years, you need a charismatic leader. You need a leader who can inspire. And actually, to be fair to the nationalists and Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, they had charismatic leaders who still were unable to deliver. They could not persuade a majority of their fellow Scots, despite their own great leadership qualities. Now the SNP has 3 candidates. I bet virtually nobody in this room even has heard of them, certainly not until a few days ago. And it may be just a coincidence, the 2 leaders of the SNP were Sturgeon and Salmond. They were big fish. Whoever wins the current election is going to be a little minnow in comparison. And that's going to make the task of persuading Scots into this great leap into the dark very much more difficult. Kate Forbes, one of the candidates, I'm not going to comment on her personal opinions, but she's from the Free Church of Scotland. My favourite Free Church of Scotland minister, they're very Sabbatarian. He was a minister in Stornoway who was told he had to preside over an ecumenical service, which he thoroughly disapproved of. And on the day he climbed into the pulpit, and he looked at the front row in front of him, and sitting there, there was a Presbyterian and an Episcopalian and a Methodist and a Baptist and a Unitarian and a Roman Catholic. And do you know how he began his sermon? He said, "Gentlemen, we are all here to serve the Lord. You in your ways, and I in his." And I have to tell you, he wasn't joking either. Now, let me turn to the immediate questions before us this evening. Because let's be clear of one thing right from the very beginning. That if Scotland was one day to vote for independence, and if it were to happen, the implications of that would make Brexit easy in comparison. We were members of the European Union for right or wrong. I was a Remainer. I wasn't a Brexiteer, but we were members of the European Union for 40 years. We chose to leave. We have left. Think of how much chaos that's produced, how much problems that's produced, the damage to the economy, and that's after 30 or 40 years of a country that was not a union that was not a state. In comparison, what we're being asked to vote for today is to break up a union that was not 40 years ago created, but has been a united kingdom, certainly from 1707, which is more than 300 years. That's the union of the parliaments. But it's actually older than that. You have to go back to the Union of the Crowns in 1603, when Scotland was never conquered. A king of Scotland became king of England. And the consequence of that, in those days, the king didn't just be a constitutional monarch. Although there was still a Scottish parliament, it was the king who ran foreign policy. It was the king who had command of the armed forces, right up till the 19th century. And so Scotland effectively has been a union, not just from 1707, but for almost 500 years. And can you imagine the consequences if a decision was taken? Well, there was a little bit of comment on the state of the Scottish economy. Well, we all know there's a huge Scottish deficit. There's much, now don't shake your head, Neil, you know perfectly well there is. Well, I'm sorry, the whole world believes it's true, and all the Scottish economists believe it's true, and if you don't believe that, then you do.
I know it's.
Well, what we're getting is faith, not reason. And faith is something which is nothing wrong with it, but not when you're in politics. That's an unfortunate mistake. That's what happened with Brexit. People believed things that was not supported by the facts, and we're all living with the consequences of that. So what would be the immediate consequences? We would have to, yes, create a currency. And I've no doubt that Scotland create a currency in 6 months, 9 months, or a year or so. Of course it could. The question is not could it create a currency, but what would the value be of that currency? If you create a new value, a new currency, and you say it's on par with the pound, it's worth exactly the same as the pound, immediately that currency comes into effect. The markets will decide what its value is. And if you're living in a country which I'm afraid the markets believe does have a huge deficit, and where oil will not be around for a long time to come, then the value of your currency immediately starts to plummet. Now, I'm going to then turn to a more fundamental question, because I don't want this issue just to be addressed in the question. Yes, by all means, of course.
I think I illustrated reasonably clearly about the economic viability of Scotland from a very neutral perspective. The UK currently has a AA3 rating, and Standards & Poor's, the measure of economic viability, have said they would give Scotland, an independent Scotland, a AAA rating. There's your measure.
I don't doubt for a moment that Scotland could be viable. So could Cambridge.
AAA.
So could Yorkshire. So could any part of the world could be viable. The question is whether the economy would prosper or whether it would have huge problems to overcome. But let's move on from the economy, because I don't think we're going to agree on that. The fundamental reason for the union actually isn't economic anyway. The fundamental reason is values. The basic proposition that the proposal is making is that the union was some accident of history, that it shouldn't have happened, that it was something artificial, and now the time has come to rectify it. I see you're nodding your head. Well, for once we take that point. Right. But it happens to be a fundamentally inaccurate description of what happened. The union could not be more organic in the case of the United Kingdom and in almost any other part of the world. First of all, we share an island. Secondly, we share a language. Thirdly, we share a culture. Fourthly, we share 300 years of peacefully living together. And Scotland and England were the old enemies. They went to war for hundreds of years before that. Since 1745, they haven't had a war. And even in 1745, half the people who opposed the Jacobites were Scots. So, you know, this is just not historically valid. And I make the point because it's a very fundamental point, that if you have a natural union, the question is not what's the reason for staying in, but what's the reason for leaving? And central to the arguments we've heard this evening is Scotland cannot truly realize its identity as a nation except through independence. I say that is completely bogus. The very fact that we are a united kingdom called the Four Nations. Look what happened when... I'm running out of time, but yes, a quick one, if you could.
Korea is called the Democratic People's Republic, so I wouldn't say the name actually has that much value.
Right, well, let's go along with that. No, absolutely. If that's what you want to say, I have no problem with that whatsoever. But the reason that it is able to realize its national identity, we saw that just in the last few months. When Her Majesty the Queen died, it happened to be in Scotland. And what happened? The rest of the UK came to Edinburgh. The royal family came to Edinburgh. The national ceremonial took place in Edinburgh before anything happened in London, with the Crown of Scotland in St. Giles Cathedral. That was respect for the national identity of Scotland as part of a united kingdom. And the final point, because I know I've only got 1 minute left, is simply this. There's another fundamental reason why you should vote against this motion. What message would we be sending the rest of the world? The whole world is struggling with attempts to try and get more peaceful relationships, countries that have been enemies in the past working together. We see Russia and Ukraine at this very moment, with Russia unable to accept Ukraine's right to live as it wishes. What message would we be sending to the world if the world's best example so far of two old enemies, the Scots and the English, who had numerous wars every century until the 1600s and the 1700s, but have lived in total peace since then, decide to fragment themselves because of some tired old ideology based on a nationalism that sometimes can be positive and sometimes can be even very negative in the consequences it has for the communities it seeks to serve. So my colleague ended with a quotation from Adam Smith. Let me end with one from Scotland's national bard, Robert Burns. In his address to the Dumfries volunteers, he wrote, and I will quote the actual words he uses in the poem, "Be Britons still, to Britain true, among ourselves united, for never but by British hands will British wrongs be righted." Now, that is Scotland's national bard. And if Britain was good enough for him, it should be good enough for us as well. Thank you very much.